you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense. The language in this episode may be offensive to some listeners. Listeners' discretion is strongly advised.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Darnell Samuels and Joel Nikoloff.
Bro, man, we got to talk about this character, Juicy Smoothie.
What are you talking about? Dave Chappelle.
Yeah, Chappelle's done it again.
Sticks and stones.
What? Yeah, man. That guy's a character. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, so just because this is definitely something new that we haven't really done before, and hopefully we could do more of these in the future, but why?
Well, with After Watch on the break, we kind of had to fill a gap, you know?
Yeah, right. So why an episode on stand-up comedian Dave Chappelle and his show Sticks and Stones? Like, why do an episode like this?
I mean, my first instincts were, I didn't even know that the special had dropped. So it dropped on August 26th, and I guess late last week, like Thursday, Friday, I was seeing, all these articles kind of calling him out of being, I'll see if I can find a couple of the headlines, like essentially, that is controversial. He tries too hard to offend. His new, you can definitely skip Dave Chappelle's new Netflix special, Sticks and Stones. That's the Vice headline. So it was just like, there's one by National Review, which is a little bit shocking. Dave Chappelle shouldn't defend Michael Jackson. And so, there was just so much like virtue signaling with these articles condemning him. And Chappelle is a comedian who's on another level. I'm sure we'll get into the echelon of comedian that he falls into. But I thought there was just so much negative backlash that it made it. Simply put, I had to watch the special based on how much he was getting beaten up by the left. And so I'm guessing there's lots of people in our audience who are curious but maybe unwilling to watch themselves. So we've got to fill a void for our audience.
I think, for me, I thought it was necessary to do an episode on this because I think that Dave Chappelle is a comedic genius, just like any other genius in their particular field. And when I say genius, I mean his political and economic critiques of the social justice and LGBTQ movements are profound. And I think the latter applies to us as Canadians, as being seen as the home of the LGBTQ movement. Also, his commentary on gun culture and mass shootings in the U.S. is intelligent. He has a large audience, and I think he stands alone. Like, there's nobody, like, you guys could tell me, audience listeners, let me know if I'm wrong in saying this, but I think nobody in the world can say what Dave Chappelle can say and make people laugh and seriously contemplate what he's saying. And I think that is a point of study, and I think that makes him a culture changer and a historical figure that we're going to have to pay attention to and study and look at his body of work. I think it's that profound.
I would say I put it in the class of kind of what Carlin was doing in his prime.
Sorry, who?
He was George Carlin.
Okay.
He did some similar things with respect to just really speaking in a taboo manner, which is what I would say majority of Chappelle's set list or sequences of jokes were covering things that were considered taboo.
Okay, so let me ask you just quickly, like your history with Dave Chappelle and what you know about him in a bit. For those of because we might have listeners who don't know who Dave Chappelle is, so like quickly, what would you say about Dave Chappelle and your interactions with him?
It's funny. I actually was first. I distinctly remember the first time I saw Half Baked.
What's Half Baked about?
That is, I think you would call it Chappelle's primary, if not really his only video that he wrote it. But it was like just a comedy movie. And it's about a bunch of stoners who, without getting into the movie too much, but just a bunch of stoners who have a random sequence of events happen to them and they got to help their buddy out. And, just a bunch of stoners acting stupid. It's almost a throwback to Cheech and Chong, but I would think a little bit more structure. But still, so I watched it with my wife's brother, who's actually my best friend, we were hanging out with me and him hanging out with two girls as part of our, I think it was our grade 8 grad, which, you're too young to really have any sort of grad celebration. So we just the four of us hung out, watched this movie. I'm pretty sure it was the first time I saw that movie. And then because Jenna, my wife's brother, is my best friend growing up, I watched this movie countless times, just, VHS back in the day. And then I can remember also watching Chappelle's show again with Jenna's family, her brothers, essentially having those things on DVD. And definitely not something I would definitely not recommend Chappelle's show as a family time show in any capacity. But I do think if you are in a, and we'll get into, who should watch his content, I think looking at some of his content, you would see the comedic genius come out through Chappelle's show as well. What was your exposure to Chappelle?
Well, like I said before in my interview with IJ, I was, in my younger days, I was studying to be a comedian. So I took the craft very seriously and I, dip and dabbled with it. So I was familiar with Dave Chappelle. But when I became a Christian, I kind of cut all that stuff out. So when during the heyday of the Chappelle show, I wasn't watching it. I couldn't watch it. So for the listeners are kind of like, oh, okay, that sounds more my speed. Yeah, I couldn't watch it, his stuff, just because it wasn't good for me where I was spiritually. I was still, growing and didn't want any of that bringing me down. But I would also say one of the reasons why I respect Dave Chappelle is because he walked away from the Chappelle show because of convictions he had about his content. For those of you who don't know, so he basically walked away from a deal with Comedy Central because they were going to ask him to re-up and do a season. I think it was like season 3 or season 4. But anyways, they were asking him to continue the show because it was like the top show on TV. And he walked away from all that money. And the reason why he walked away was because of conviction. He did a joke where he was dressed up as a black person, and there was a white guy behind the camera who was laughing. And Dave Chappelle said he was laughing harder than he should have. And it made Dave Chappelle feel bad about the jokes he was making and that it was hurting black people. So from that conviction he had, he shut it down, stopped the show, moved to Africa, and stopped the show cold turkey and just walked away from it all. And disappeared, didn't tell nobody where he went, disappeared for a couple of years and then came back. So for that, it shows that he does have scruples. So I respect him for that. But real quick, Joel, so before we get into the show, what, because we have a Christian audience who's listening, and they're like, okay, so Darnell wasn't listening to Dave Chappelle when he first got saved, so he must be a guy who's not helpful for Christians. So should a Christian watch Sticks and Stones by Dave Chappelle? What would you say?
I think it's not a question I could give a blanket answer to say, all Christians should avoid this, or I mean, is watching comedy of this, let's call it elk, sinful? I don't think the answer is no. Or sorry, I don't think it's sinful to watch this content in and of itself. With that said, applying a biblical principle to this, if you find that watching content that's touching on subject, so if you're watching a TV show that has any sort of sexual content, even if it's just simply people in a relationship, and that's causing you to become lustful, well, to continue to watch that content would be sinful. But to watch that content without knowing that it's going to cause you that kind of temptation, and then just experience the temptation, wouldn't be regarded as sinful. So in that regard, I think there's a bit of discernment required. Knowing where you at in your spiritual walk, knowing where you're at, in your maturity, or simply put, if you're a young Christian who's, new to the faith, then watching any sort of content that isn't about feeding your soul positively, I would be telling them to really take your time and think wisely before watching some content like this.
Okay. And then I would say that of the biblical warnings that we see in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 22, abstain from all appearances of evil, and Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, about finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think of these things. We should use discernment when navigating secular entertainment. With that said, for those people who are mature enough to be able to see the truth, beauty, and goodness in the set, you should watch it. And I think you said it best to me, Joel. Like, you wouldn't recommend this show to just anybody, but because you know me, you would recommend it to me. And because you know me, I love comedy, and technically it was recommended to me by our guy Jade. Shout out to Jade Dillon, who said, like, yo, Darnell, you need to take this in and you need to talk about this. So thank you for the idea, Jade. And yeah, so there's still a discernment there, but for those people who don't have that discernment, it's okay. We here at the Sixth Sense Report aren't in the business of stumbling our brothers and sisters and calling them to do something they can't do or don't want to do. What Joel and I are going to do is we will be doing the watching for you. So you don't have to watch the show. We'll watch it for you, and we'll break it down and really hit the key points that are good key talking points for good conversation. So without further ado, let's look at the first sequence. We're going to be looking at 5.
So before we jump into the content, if you haven't seen the show or the episode and you want to watch it, recommendation would be to watch it, because we're not going to be giving some crazy level of spoilers, but in order to talk about the jokes, we're going to have to kind of
go into detail.
Just maybe ruin the punchline a little bit, or a couple of the punchlines. I mean,
yes,
the whole thing is just constant punchline, right?
Yes, so, of course. And rule of thumb, just for everybody to know, you shouldn't be retelling comedians' jokes because it's just never going to be funny. So don't expect Dave Chappelle from Joel Nikoloff. It's not going to happen.
No.
Okay.
We're not going to do it justice.
Yeah, we won't. Yeah. So please don't be like, oh, Darnell's not funny. I'm like, well, no, I'm not trying to be. I'm just telling you what he said. So the 5 things we're going to touch on this episode are his impressions, celebrity hunting season, or cancel culture. And then third, we're going to talk about alphabet people and transracial ideas. 4, we're going to talk about mass shootings, and 5, we're going to talk about the secret epilogue.
Don't forget Juicy Smoothie, bro.
Oh yeah, well, yeah, Juicy Smoothie.
We'll just have a, it'll kind of, I think, come up. In
It'll
some of the other
flow.
parts
It'll
of the
flow
com-
in
yeah,
there.
yeah.
Okay,
But,
cool.
Because
Okay, good. So okay, so let's start. He opens up with impressions. So talk about what happened in that impression.
Technically, it's joke 2, or sequence 2.
Okay.
But he kind of says, "Oh, I don't normally do this, but I'm going to start with impressions." What I think is really funny about that is he's kind of lying to the audience, because he's saying, "I never do impressions," but in reality, he does do impressions. He just doesn't explicitly do impressions. So what I mean by that is the impressions aren't usually the joke. Impressions, filter throughout his jokes as a means to convey the story. Throughout he does an impressions of Nigerians. He does a white heroin addict, a Chinese person.
Yeah, but for that set, well, what was the key one for this set?
So my point is, though, like, he does impressions all the time. With this, he starts out going, he does one impression, which we won't speak about, but it's pretty funny. It's just a one-liner. Second one, he's asking the audience to tell, "Oh, who am I?" Right? And he goes on this rant, and essentially he's going on a rant mocking the cancel culture, as he refers to it, and goes, "I am you," and he points at the audience, and he's like, "You guys are the ones who are gonna, doesn't matter what I say, 10, 30, 20 years from now, you're gonna use it against me when that issue or that joke is so far offside, but at the time that I said it, it wasn't." And so I thought it was, if you look at this whole show as a body of work, it actually the fact that the comedy special is called Sticks and Stones, he's really referencing this idea of, like, why are we allowing the things people say to play so much of an impact, in the sense of just simply, someone's opinion is different than mine, therefore I need to, punish them, right? Or cancel culture idea, right? With regards to Kevin Hart, which comes up later in his set, or things along those lines. Someone says something at one point in time, now it's time to go after them abundantly or super aggressively. And so I think he does a really good job with that joke, just to set the stage for the audience, because they're about to hear a serious sequence of jokes. Like, I think literally every joke after that is largely considered offside to talk about.
Right. I would add that also, before, like, as the show opens up, he opens up with a line from Prince, the song 1999, and he quotes and he says, "I was dreaming when I wrote this. Forgive me if it goes astray. But when I woke up this morning, could have sworn it was Judgment Day. The sky was all purple. There were people running everywhere, trying to run from the destruction. I didn't even care." And
so why did that stand out to you so much?
Well, of course, he quotes from one of the greatest musicians alive, but also that, yes, he is trying to run from the destruction, but he didn't even care. But there's definitely, he's definitely calling on the fire, or as we say, he wants the smoke, and he's looking for judgment from people, but he doesn't care. He's going all in on this episode, and that's what he was letting us know, that he's going to speak his mind, and he's going to speak it freely. And that's exactly what he did in this set, where he jumps into talking about celebrity hunting season, right? Or cancel culture. What did you think about that?
I think, the celebrity hunting season thing, I think he addresses the absurdity of the principles that are underlying so much of the things that are going on in mainstream culture today. And so what I mean by that is, the cancel culture or the celebrity hunting season, for example, Kevin Hart, he's pointing out that, like, okay, wait, what is the principle that underlines why we're upset here? And although he's not explicitly saying that, he's using jokes to demonstrate that if we take this principle and apply it in different contexts, and it's not just this cancel culture, I think this is actually a really good summary of his comedic genius, that why I find it so such a high quality comedy, because he's taking you down a string of concepts and jokes, but he's maintaining that principle. And then all of a sudden, he applies that principle to a scenario and goes, all of a sudden you're like, but that doesn't make any sense. But he's being logically consistent. And so, the celebrity hunting season one gets into the use of a word that largely...
Well, hold on. Let me just speak on the Kevin Hart real quick.
Okay. Yeah, let's.
Yeah, so he says, 4 tweets that Kevin Hart is 4 tweets shy of being perfect. And I thought that although, these guys are all, buddies and they're all running the same group, I think Dave Chappelle in that sequence, he set himself apart from Kevin Hart, where he was saying like, okay, yeah, he was 4 tweets shy of being perfect. And those 4 tweets were talking about the F word. But as Joel is about to jump into that, but I think that he was saying, okay, you know what? Kevin Hart was doing his thing because usually comedians are to be unapologetic. And Kevin Hart was unapologetic until he apologized for the comments he made. And therefore, that kind of compromised his craft as a comedian in being honest in his assessment of things. So now Dave Chappelle steps in and he's like, well, guess what? I'm going to be honest. And then that's where Joel is about to pick up into the F word.
Yeah, so I think, this is where, what he's pointing at is like, or what he's playing, the Kevin Hart scenario, he unpacks it a bit to get to the point that, like, he's playing back to that joke where he's mocking the audience or the culture of there's nothing I can do, or I always need to be worried about what I do today coming up to me in 5 to 10 years. Or what he's really saying at the same time is like, I don't care. I'm not going to care. Comedy is not about, and actually it comes up in the epilogue when he tells a story, but we'll get to the epilogue thing later. But it comes up in a manner of, if we're unable to laugh about things, that kind of demonstrates, I think, more about the audience than it does about the person who made the joke.
Right.
That was offside. Now, granted, there's certain jokes that, like, aren't funny and they're just malice. And so this is where I would say, if you're reading an article on this comedy special and the author is kind of describing it in a way that's like painting Dave Chappelle as malice or ignorance, not the word, but he's painting Dave Chappelle as like not caring about something, and he's just trying to diminish these people, or he's trying to write these people off as ridiculous, or we shouldn't care about this issue, then I would say that person is virtue signaling. Then they're not steel manning Dave Chappelle.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this sequence gets into the idea of using, basically Dave Chappelle tells this story, and he gets called into, and technically, Darnell, I think you should tell the story, but I'll kind of it. The audience will understand why I'm saying you need to tell the story. But
all right.
But let me, I'll preface it. So the issue is he gets called into standards
By the
and
Department of Standards and Practices, yeah.
Yeah, he gets called in for on the Chappelle show. He wrote a joke with using the word faggot, and the use of that word was basically they were not willing to allow.
Yeah. So then Dave Chappelle. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
you tell this part.
So Dave Chappelle basically gets called into the office of Department of Standards and Practices for using the word faggot in his the Chappelle show. And so, he's talking to the lady and she says, and this is the comedic genius where he's imitating her, and then, she's like, well, yeah, you can't use the word. And she says, faggot softly. And Dave Chappelle, every time he uses the word, he yells it. He yells the word. Excessively. Like just.
Now, this isn't new. I was realizing while I was watching this, he always yells that word. Like, I don't know what it is. Just when he's telling jokes and he's using that word, there's this extra enunciation of the word. And I think it's because he's actually playing off the fact that this word has connotations that, I mean, it's not like the N-bomb where we attribute it with slavery. Now, maybe it's...
Hey, okay, hold on. One thing at a time. I'm probably disagree, but one thing at a time. So,
I just want to make my point in the so it's not taken out of context. Maybe there's an aspect where this word has... I'll use the word homophobic history that is very oppressive, but I don't know. It's literally one of two words that has such heavy connotation.
Yeah, but okay. So he goes to the woman and she says, "Don't use it, don't use it." And Dave Chappelle says, "Okay, I won't use it." And then he's leaving the office, and then he turns back around and says to the woman. She's like, so if I can't say that, why?
He's like, how come?
Yeah, so how come I can't? How come, how come we're allowed to say the word nigger? How come I can't say faggot? And she says, well, you can't say it because
you're not gay.
You're not gay. And he says, so how come we're allowed to say nigger? How come the word nigger's not banned? And he says to her, because I'm, and she kind of insinuated that, well, because you're from that demographic, so you can say that. And he says, but I'm not a nigger. And
I was when
that was the genius. That was the genius in the joke, because like it was him saying, okay, well, look, okay, I guess because you're only if you're gay you can use the word faggot, and only if you're black you can use the word nigger. But I'm not a nigger because that's not what I am. And so she was just saying that, okay, well, you can't use the word faggot because you're not gay, but you can use the word nigger because you're a nigger. That was and
I mean, when he said that, I was like instantly taken back to Chris Rock. Now I don't know if that was intentional or I mean it's you. I think you had mentioned that he's had content like this.
Yeah, because I tweeted a Chris Rock joke a while back about how Chris Rock loves black people but hates niggers.
And Chris Rock has a skit. I almost want to say it's from Def Comedy Jam. But I don't know for sure. And it's funny because it actually one demonstrates the deeper context of these words have more than one meaning. Right? Like, yes, we associate the F word with, gay. But generally speaking, when someone's using it in a, I don't want to say derogatory, but aggressive manner or using it as an insult, are they using it as, oh, you're gay? And like pointing it, I would have said maybe in the 70s and the 80s. Today, how is it used? I don't know. I'm just, again, I'm kind of brainstorming on the fly as I'm saying these things, because it's the point that Dave Chappelle's pointing out, the fact that we, like, there's a little bit of like, what the heck is going on here? This doesn't totally make sense. If I apply these principles universally,
there's contradiction. There's contradictions there. So that's where, again, I say that's where I think this comedic genius part plays up, or continually shows up through his content, is he's demonstrating the fact that this principle actually is contradictory. Yeah, no, I would totally agree. And it was definitely profound, because I was like, why can we say the word nigger? Like, because I'm not one. And as a black man, I was like, I totally agree with that. I'm like, I'm not a nigger. So what are you insinuating? And we use these words. But you
totally have impunity in using that word, right? Like, no one's gonna. I mean, there might be some people who would ask you to, hey, I don't like that word. Can you not use that word around me?
Mm-hmm.
And so be it. But for the most part, no one's gonna hold it against you in the way that they would hold it against me.
Yeah, but I think as a black male, I know from with most black people, it's always us against them when it comes to the homosexual community, and them being more privileged than black people, because that was also the sentiment that Dave Chappelle was pointing out, that okay, so it's illegal to use the word faggot. We can't say that, but we can use the word nigger. Why? Right? We shouldn't, and essentially, we shouldn't be using any. We shouldn't be saying both, but because of those are politically charged terms, Dave Chappelle intentionally would yell it. And I think what he was basically trying to show people is, I can say this and you guys can't do nothing to me. There's nothing you can do to me. Cancel culture. You can't. And I think that's why he's such a big figure and a prolific figure, and will eventually be a historical figure, because I believe Dave Chappelle cannot be stopped. You can stop Dave Chappelle. You could stop Barack Obama. Don't vote for him. You know what I mean? You could stop anybody. You can't stop Dave Chappelle, because, you can't own him. You don't own him. He's his own man. Like, he can stop doing comedy tomorrow and he's good.
Yeah.
You know
I mean, financially, but also, if you look at the way he tours, he's not beholden to anybody, right? Like, Netflix is paying him because they want the content.
How much are they paying for this one?
$20 million.
Okay, yeah, 21. And actually, that the set he did for the Netflix special, the tickets were $800.
No, that's incorrect. The set, the tickets for the Netflix special were $60. You see it in the epilogue. It was $800 when he was on Broadway.
Okay. Yeah.
2 weeks later, which is part of the epilogue.
Yeah.
I'll put basically as part. There's kind of a hidden part 2.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. We'll get there.
I'll put it in the show notes page.
Yeah. So but that's a good point. Yeah, but either way, the ticket to see his show was $800. So
in Broadway.
Yeah, so it was one of those things where you can see the power of Dave Chappelle and him being able to say what nobody else can say. And that's why I thought, looking at the stand-up and looking at him and his work is important. So like, he gets into this next part about the alphabet people.
Before we get there, there's one other thing that I should have mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And this comes from one of the 2. I'll put 2 Joe Rogan clips in the show notes page too, because I think he speaks about Chappelle in a very insightful way, just in terms of understanding him. And that's the one where he talks about being on tour with him. But another one is about being on the top of his game. He talks about Chappelle. Basically, did you notice what he was wearing?
Oh yeah. We're gonna.
It was
use
a
it as
branded
thumbnail.
jumpsuit.
Yeah.
Like a prison jumpsuit, but with his brand on it, his name on it.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also say though, it had style.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he had a bit of, he was subliminal messaging in line with what you're saying. Like, you can't put me in jail. You can't put me in timeout. Like there's a bit of that.
You can't
kind of
cancel me.
subliminally. Yeah, you can't like this cancel culture. It doesn't matter.
Yeah,
As
it
you
doesn't
said,
apply
I
to
can
him.
say whatever I want. You can't touch me.
Which is a beauty because, like I said, it's always good to hear people speak honestly, even though we might not like what they say. It's always good for people to speak honestly to help push a conversation, address tough topics and problems. But the third segment that we wanted to talk about was the alphabet people. Touch on that real quick, Joel.
Yeah, well, I mean, so for anyone who hasn't figured it out, this is, I mean, we're using his punchline. He's referring to LGBTQ as the alphabet people, and that alone, I was like, okay, that's funny. Like whether you're pro or anti or whatever your stance is on all of the issues in terms of right now, calling them alphabet people is just funny. Because he's like, they've garnered 25% of the alphabet. It's like, or whatever, percentage he said.
Yeah, that's what he said. Yeah.
It's like, it's funny. Like, it doesn't matter what their stance is on the issue, but there's going to be people who are taking issue with it. And I thought, the way I would summarize the jokes, he had this, he had really 3 or 2 topics within his different jokes. One was kind of talking about the infighting within this, the alphabet people. So but also in line with that was like comparing and contrasting the people within in that movement, if you want to call it that. But then the very end of the joke, he does what I've been saying is like he takes the principle of, it comes down to trans and the trans issues, and he takes that principle and then applies it to a different context and goes, but we kind of see this is absurd. And so, the joke is he's like, what if I thought I was Asian on the inside? And every time I wanted to walk around talking a particular way.
Well, he wasn't talking. He was making a facial feature of an Asian person.
And voice, too. His voice.
So he was doing it. Yeah. But his wife is Asian.
And he made the joke. He's like, it only comes out when we're really fighting.
Yeah. So, but I thought that was a pretty interesting perspective on the racial, the transracial idea and alphabet people. But yeah, I thought the analogy between like about the LGBTQ and everybody, riding in the car and their different nuances and where they're arguing. I thought that was pretty clever, and drawing those distinctions. So it was a pretty cool set.
Yeah, because at the same time it was funny for someone who's, let's call it like, I would say I would be largely ignorant to majority of people in that group. That it was insightful. Right? At the same time, like, yes, there's an aspect where I'm not going to take it as like totally true, but I'm going to I can actually garner knowledge at the same time that I'm laughing at this. And I think that's where, comedy holds a place in society that the cancel culture is ignoring. And that is really it's a bridge between people who, see things differently, where comedy can be a place where we can laugh at ourselves. We can laugh at each other in a way that like brings the walls down, brings the fighting down.
Yeah. Okay, so the next one is mass shootings.
I think he just has such, the way he told this joke like was interesting because he made the story very, very personal. Right? Because he made it about like his kids and going through it as a parent.
Oh yeah. Yo, and so he says, so he says, son, so how was school? And he's like, oh, we practice, a drill.
We didn't really have school today.
Yeah, we practiced the mass shooting drill. And he's like, if there's a mass shooting. And then he had to break the news to his son. He's like, well, you know what, son, like the mass shooting drill's not going to help, because if they're going to come in and shoot you, you're probably going to get killed. And actually, they might even come after you because of who I am and the craziness that I talk. And he says, so when they start shooting at you, remember to run in zigzags. So
Get low and run.
yeah, get low and
zigzags.
start running zigzags. And it was just like, so he just jumped right in, and I thought it was very funny. And of course, yeah, because he's like, yeah, there's a lot of, happens a lot of shootings that happen. So he was just like he's become numb to it. But he started to point out an interesting nuance about, he's like these drills don't help, because what we're doing is we're informing the potential shooter on our procedures. So
and where all the kids, like the potential shooter is in the class.
Right, and they're gonna know all the procedures, and so that he kind of like just simply says, yeah, and the next the shooter is putting his hand up and asking, okay, so where are we lining up again?
Supposed to be?
Where are we lining up? Right.
Yeah.
So I thought
Where are we all
that was,
meeting?
I thought that was very profound. I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Like, yeah, technically, yeah, if you're gonna shoot up a school, and you're sitting in the class and they're walking through the procedures and like, okay, so the police come here and the police come here, and when the police knocks 3 times, you open the door. Okay, great. I know if knock 3 times, teacher opens up, I'm spraying up the class. Like, it's a terrifying thing, but I was just like, oh yeah, that's right, because the killer's in the class. So, but then he starts talking about the parents who are raising these killers, and as the parents are kind of like, okay, well, who, it's not me, or who is it? And then he kind of emphasized.
Well, so everyone's kind of looking around, going like, is your kid the potential? Is your kid the potential? Right?
Yeah.
Like,
and then he points out white people as statistically raising the shooters. And I would like to ask you, like how do you respond to that, Joel? Like when you see it's mostly white kids who do these things, well, what would you say to that?
I mean, I find it interesting. I think it's like, statistically speaking, I find it interesting, right? Being more analytically minded, I start to think about, okay, what are the other factors that make this true, or that are the cause? Because the fact that your skin color is white has nothing to do with it, in my opinion, right? There's whether it's a cultural aspect, or whether it's whatever it is, right? What is different about the white kids than the black kids that makes this more likely? Now, just being, super, like, if I was to speculate, my first question would be like, okay, do we prescribe antipsychotic medication to white kids more than we do to other demographics? Because there's a commonality that I think I read something like all but one of the mass shooters in the last 25 years have been on antipsychotic medication. So the point I'm trying to make is like, okay, do we prescribe these drugs to white kids more often? Do we have a problem with more absentee parents making it more likely to diagnose their kids that they need these drugs? Like, I don't know. These are all just questions. I don't know the answer. I'm not trying to say that I have the question, but as a statistician, I'd start to say, okay, what are the delimiting factors? And so I find it funny, but it also makes me wonder, like, oh, like, it makes me think about it intellectually. And this goes back to your point of, or, to where I think this special has value is it's potentially causing us to have a conversation, right? So, go back to the alphabet people joke with regards to wrong body, wrong race, essentially is the way that I, was classifying it, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm an Asian person in a black guy's body.
Yeah. Or the analogy of LeBron James changing his sex and then going from the NBA to the WNBA and scoring 800 points a game. So I was just like, yeah, those were good analogies.
So he's raising questions that, like, if we're willing to have honest conversations, these are questions that, yeah, your proposed solution doesn't work.
Yeah.
Or if we just simply, using the trans scenario to say, well, if gender is another characteristic like race, why does what you're saying about being born in the wrong gender body different than being born in the wrong race?
Yeah.
Well, right? Like, so his point is, like, you might come to the conclusion that that's a stupid question because of X, Y, and Z factors. Okay, fine. Like, we can come to that conclusion. But to say you're not allowed to ask that question because it's insensitive, I think is what he's showing as the problem.
Yeah.
Similarly, you could say the same thing about the whole WNBA, NBA thing with LeBron, right? Like, hey, let's use an absurd example, but Bruce Jenner's technically a good example. If he had converted when he was the Olympian athlete, what would we have done? And reality is, you don't have a good answer to that question. And so recognizing that as much as you might dismiss this question as being insensitive and mean, it also demonstrates that your proposed solution has problems. And so that's where the comedic genius to me comes into play, is because he's highlighting some of the political issues as being much deeper than we're willing to discuss.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. So what about the Juicy Smollett?
I thought
that sketch.
I was just, the
sorry.
great
He's
thing
he's
about
sorry.
it-
He's referring to Jussie Smollett.
and
sorry,
never
real quick. For
Yeah,
those
go
of you
ahead.
who don't know what he did, is basically he lied about a hate crime being done to him. Sorry, go ahead, Joel.
and there's really no speculation left. Like we know he lied about it. He set the whole thing up. It's a huge controversy. So, anyways,
Yeah.
What I loved, I just thought it was funny. He retold the story with mockery, but in a manner that was entertaining. Like, and calling him Juicy Smoothie, and never.
Why was he
dropping
doing
it.
that? Why was he doing that? I was confused about that.
I think it was just him like being funny, like
And
it was
him
just
being
silly.
French? Was it?
Yeah, like because he's a gay French black guy, and so I don't know if Chappelle just thought, I should use a different name, right? But I thought, to be honest, had he retold this without the different name, it wouldn't have been as funny. The Juicy Smoothie, because he's telling you the story as if you don't know what happened. I mean,
how ridiculous, because he said, a lot of black people were quiet about the whole situation because for black people you were kind of like, what,
this doesn't
it doesn't add up. Yeah, he just says, to a black person you're like, yes, that's a hate crime, but it doesn't add up. He says, and he made a good point, like as a detective, and he kind of took like a detective approach to it, because he was like, wait a minute, the person called you a nigger and a faggot from Empire. He's like, first of all, anybody who's homophobic or racist isn't watching Empire, and they don't know who you are. And I was like, yeah, that's right. Unless
when he said that, I was like, oh damn.
I'm like, yeah, that's right. They wouldn't know who you are. And then he was just talking about like, you're in Chicago, and he's just like, he's like, you're going late at night in the cold, and just things weren't adding up. They're just like, like wearing a MAGA hat in Chicago and this and this.
He's
and
like,
that.
where's Kanye?
Yeah. Do a background check where Kanye was at that time. But it was one of those things where, he just started adding things up. You're like, yeah, this doesn't make any sense. He's like, how many of you guys have actually been to Chicago? Have you guys seen a rope anywhere in Chicago? He's like right now, not in the 1850s, but now. Like where's anybody get a rope from to hang him from? You know what I mean?
It was, I think, the Juicy Smoothie line made it so that he kind of made it a personal story, and at least that's how it felt for me, right? Like when he made the joke "Justice for Juicy," I was dying, right? But like he couldn't have said that. Like "Justice for Jesse" is not funny, right? And so I don't know how much of it, like, why did he do it? Maybe it's just like some of the phonetic sounds of it just made it work. I listen to a lot of Joe Rogan, and he talks about so many times, people ask him about being a comedian, and he just, he talks about, when we see these Netflix specials that, like, the year before this is really them working out the joke, right? So it might even be this right now. So Juicy Smoothie was, I'm labeling it as like sequence 11. Maybe he originally told this at sequence 6, and so some of that, their earlier shows getting ready for the special is even figuring out, where does this joke fit, right? And I thought the way he did this entire lineup of jokes was was really, really good. Like, it all flowed so well, especially when I look at my notes afterwards and kind of go like, oh my goodness. Like, he lined up, I mean, we didn't get to them, but he lined up a couple gun things in a row. Like, for example, like we talked about, the mass shootings, but he had 2 more sequences after that were, or 3 really, related to guns. And they were, the question I would have is like, hey, maybe what would it, was the mass shootings always the first one? And this is, again, comedic genius / working out your craft is kind of a term I think Joe Rogan uses, but the idea that like, maybe just changing a word or changing the order of the punchline just slightly and realizing like, oh wait, this works better than this. And so, how much of this was something he just jumped on right away and was like naturally came to him versus he told this story because in the epilogue he told the story.
Well, yeah, we're gonna transition to that. So yeah, start talking about the epilogue now.
So the epilogue is essentially a 22 minute kind of add-on that you have to. There's a couple weird ways to catch it. I'll put it in the show notes page. But essentially, if you're watching the special and you let it run all the way through, it should autoplay on Netflix as like, let's call it episode 2 of Sticks and Stones. The first part is about the 2 weeks later when he was at Broadway, and I thought that was the best additional comedy content. But overall, the entire epilogue, I mean, I love Q&A type stuff, and most of it's Q&A with the audience, like post this, probably this set or a set very, very, very similar. And so, he's just doing Q&A, sitting on the stage with a smoke and a drink, just, talking to the audience, letting them ask questions, and just, but then also being his comedic self, and then kind of adding skits within his storytelling. So what I brought this up was that in the epilogue, he talked about, just different things that give you insight into, maybe even where this joke came from. So he talks about the fact that right after this happened, he was in an event where nobody was supposed to have their phones, it's all locked up and everything. He's like, I didn't know there was a reporter in there who took impeccable notes. And it's just like, he's basically saying the reporter basically brought their phone in, recorded the whole thing. And fortunately, he was saying that he was critical of the story before it broke, that it was that the Nigerians were caught, who were the ones who roughed them up. And so, I think of that as like, how much was him just, during his show, also just having some social commentary and having fun with the audience, just saying like, hey, I'm not trying to say whether he's innocent or guilty, but hey, there's some weird things in this story that just don't make sense, right? Yeah. He said, the things that the MAGA wearing hat white supremacist said to him sounded like Dave Chappelle's like, that sounds like what I would say, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it doesn't sound like what a KKK person would say.
Yeah, that's funny.
And so how much of that was just him going, hey, you know what, because he said when the reporter published it, he thought, okay, I'm done. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, right after that, Juicy Smoothie got busted. Yeah. For setting the whole thing up.
Yeah. So what would be your 2 cents you want to leave the listeners with?
I mean, first thought is, I'm going to put a bunch of the articles in the show notes with respect to, people being critical of him, as well as a couple that were positive, just to provide some balance. But I think, I think Chappelle is putting his finger on the fact that we are creating more and more issues that we can't have dialogue about. You either have to be on the right side of history and you have to hold a particular view. There's no room for nuance. There's no room for conversation. And I think his special really puts a finger on the fact that, like, he really just pokes fun at all of the things that we're not allowed to talk about, right? Like, for example, mass shootings. We're not allowed to have a conversation around, what are we going to do here? Like, literally, gun control is the only answer. If you don't like gun control, you want kids to die. Like, okay, those are both absurd. Like, this is absurd, right? Like, that's not having a conversation. That's holding to an ideology. And so my 2 cents is that, take this as, somebody who, comedians are always the people who talk about the thing we're not supposed to talk about. And they, they do it in a manner to try to make people laugh. They're not doing it in a manner to, like, I'm not, obviously not all comedians, but in general, comedians are trying to make people laugh. They're not trying to belittle people for the sake of belittling people. They're trying to point out something that's funny and ironic. And, there's a trans person that shows up in the epilogue who laughed hysterically. He said they laughed at, in the epilogue, it said that they laughed at the trans jokes harder than the rest of the jokes. And that's, I think that's something that we're losing in our culture today, about laughing at ourselves for things that are, they are what they are, right? Like, if someone makes a critical comment towards Christians that is funny, I should be able to laugh about it.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can't, that's a problem, because I'm so, I don't know what the right classification of that characteristic is, but it just doesn't sound right to me, that we shouldn't be able to laugh at the things that are even silly or weird, right? Like, I'm laughing at it because I'm recognizing, yeah, it's a little peculiar. So what about you? What's your 2 cents? What do you want to leave the audience with, whether they're Christian or not? I mean, maybe the, cursing and, talking about taboo subjects like Michael Jackson and pedophilia is something that they don't want any interest in.
Yeah, I think that, like I talked about the comedic genius of Dave Chappelle and the irony of the comedian being seen as silly and uneducated. Dave Chappelle flips, and a lot of other comedians flip that on its head, because this special, he was giving a lot of intellectual insight into a lot of controversial issues that we've been having in our culture, and the level of seriousness that he comes at these topics with, but with humor. Like, he does a very good job of mixing the both of them. And that's where the comedic genius is. And so the application point I would leave, or my 2 cents I would leave the listener with, is that we should be having more uncensored conversations. And the application for the Christian would be Dave Chappelle's uncensored commentary on these difficult topics opens the door for the Christian to be biblically uncensored in our witness, in bringing biblical holistic solutions to these problems. So, yeah, it's important to be able to be brave and be prayerful in crossing that line.
So I think the thing that frustrates me with Christian content is, in light of what you just said about having uncensored conversation, that we're not engaging in conversation about living peacefully with the foreigner. And what I mean by that is, how do we, bring up, how do we engage in conversation with somebody who doesn't hold to a biblical worldview and try to reconcile about living under the same laws? Right? I mean, it's like in Cross Politic, for example, when I listen to their show, sometimes I'm like, are you almost recommending evangelism through the law? Do you know, by telling people what's wrong, by making it legislatively wrong, we're somehow going to that's a form of sharing the gospel or carrying out God's justice. And the reason I bring that up here is just to say that this idea of uncensored conversation, where how do we just engage in conversation to understand the other side? pursue understanding their perspective. Don't pursue telling them why their perspective is wrong. Because I think that's part of this problem that, you know, the Christian side of it, use the trans bathroom scenario as a, you know, an example where there's just a lack of conversation around, okay, let's try to find a solution that works for everybody. It's like, I think there's two sides to that. There's both, you know, being unapologetic with sharing the biblical worldview, but I think it also requires us to have an understanding perspective that we need to be willing to hear where people are coming from and not just trying to shut them down and tell them that they're wrong because we're trying to convey or convert them. Oh, on that note, I want to you know, the last episode, we got some really good feedback from audience. I appreciate it. I think, you know, we want to see more of that, whether it's commenting, sharing, you know, just tell us what you think. I mean, with respect to this show, with respect to this episode, you know, tell us if you think we missed the point, or if you think we missed something, if you think we're, you know, if you think there's a joke he made that's way too offside, you know, give us your 2 cents. And we want to engage.
What you guys, for those of you who watched it, let us know what you guys think. For those of you guys who heard the episode, let us know if you had any more questions. You can reach us at 6 Cents Report on Twitter and on Facebook. Joel also took the courtesy of drawing up a nifty Excel spreadsheet on the show on the topics he touched. So if you want a copy of that, you can email us.
6 cents makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?